Hello, Brain Damaged Philosopher here. This is going to be the second entry in my series of lectures on my ethical system, Eudaimonistic Egoism. So in this section, I'm going to be analyzing how I arrive at the knowledge that there actually is some desire that all humans share, and that is an overriding desire that is in effect under all circumstances and can trump any other desire. A desire that satisfies those criteria is what I consider the best way, as I mentioned in my previous video on metaethics, to actually fulfill the purpose of ethics, to find a system that can guide all of the actions of all reasonable people. So, to begin with, if we look at the structure of an action, a human action, and remember, this is taking into account what I said in the final video of my epistemology series about the idea that we humans do in fact act. If we look at the structure of an action, the reason that we act is to produce some change in the state of the world that will then produce some change in the state of our experiences for the better. In essence, an action is undertaken in order to further some end that we desire. If you think about it, there's really no other reason that we would act. Action takes time that could be used for other things, even resting. It takes energy. And so the only reason, and action is not the default. Action is something that we must, in essence, make ourselves do. We must decide to do. And so there must be some reason for acting, and that is what we call the end of an action. Now, most ends to the actions that we do are, or at least many, are actually used to enable us to act further in order to essentially further other ends. And so the ends that are only sought in order to enable further ends are essentially subordinate to those further ends, because if it were not for our desire for the further ends, then we would not desire the closer ends. And so now the thing though is that if we follow back this chain of reasons why we pursue each end in the chain of ends, and we keep asking, well, why do I desire this, and why do I desire that, and so on, right? Eventually, we're going to need to come to some ultimate end, which doesn't require a reason for it to be desired, but is simply desirable for itself and in itself. Because as humans, we have finite minds, and finite time to resolve decisions in. And so, in order for action to happen in the first place, there has to be a finite chain of reasons that can motivate us through desire to actually take that action. Because if the chain of actions never ended, chain of reasons and desires never ended, then each desire would be technically null, because we had not analyzed the previous one, and obviously we cannot analyze an infinite number, which is what would be necessary to make an infinite chain collapse, because we don't have an infinite amount of time and mental space to do it in. And so this means that in order for action to happen at all for humans, we have to desire some things purely for themselves and find them desirable of themselves. And since we see that humans do actually act, that means that there are such desires. Now, from that chain of reasoning, it's entirely possible that there could be multiple such ends, and they might, conflict or override each other, and in that sense, would not necessarily work for an ethical system unless we actually dealt with them collectively. However, the fact that they could conflict means that we would have to decide between any of those multiple ends that are desired for themselves. And whatever decision we would make would be based on not just another reason and ultimately another desire. Because any choice we make must be motivated not just by reasoning, but a desire to make us care about that reasoning. And so if we had multiple ends which we desired for themselves, any action we would take in favor of one would mean that we were not choosing to act in favor of another first, at the very least. And there might be other even cases where they conflict even more. And so the choice, the reasoning that we use to choose between them, and ultimately the desire that motivates to make the choice that we do and listen to that reasoning, must be an even further end that is both desired for itself and singular, so nothing can conflict with it, so it can make decisions between other things. And if anything was actually on the level of that ultimate end, then we would need another ultimate end to make the choice. And so we must ultimately come back to a single end that can decide all of our actions and motivate all of them. Now, the question becomes then, what is this end? Well, from my epistemology, one of the things that we know is that the only thing that we have actual direct and necessary connection to is our own experiences. We have no actual connection to the outside world, only our experiences of it. And so any end that we desire cannot be some ontological or metaphysical property of the world, apart from our experience of that property. And so the end must ultimately come down to something, a desire for something to be experienced, even if it is the experience of knowing something metaphysically true about the external world. It still must be the experience that we are actually seeking, because we cannot actually directly desire anything metaphysical. And this essentially rules out like Platonism and stuff like that. The other thing that one might say about this end, from this perspective, is that because it is an experience, it must come before death. What I mean by that is that if this experience is constituted in and necessarily only consummated at the moment of death, then it could never be experienced, because it would only begin just as one ceased to exist. This is why the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism don't work. They essentially say that life is suffering, the cause of suffering is desire, and then the cessation of desire will end suffering. The problem is that if life and suffering are identical, then the cessation of desire requires the cessation of life. And this makes sense because to pursue life requires, or to have life requires a pursuing of it and a maintenance of it, which needs action, and action requires desire. Therefore, any end which is metaphysical or is constituted in death or the denial of experience or life, it cannot be what we are looking for when I'm talking about this ultimate end. And furthermore, this ultimate end must, as I mentioned, be desired for itself, only for itself, and must be subordinate to nothing else. Now, the only experience that comes before death that we desire for itself, that is desired for no other reason, and that is overriding over anything else, that satisfies all of these criteria, is happiness. But what really do I mean by happiness? Because if we define happiness in terms of the thing that satisfies those criteria, which we know must exist, we don't really learn much else about it than what I talked about through those criteria. And this is where we have to delve a little bit into something like biological teleology. So, if we consider a living being, any living being, it obviously has to maintain its life and pursue it. But more than that, all living beings desire, or if desire perhaps isn't the right word, in some cases, all living beings pursue growth. And by growth, I mean the best expression of the potential faculties that they could possess. Think of it like health, right? To be healthy for a person is to have the best physical expression in line with what a human is supposed to have, with what a human can have, in a balanced way, right? And the way that you gain health is by doing actions that are like the actions that humans were supposed to do, or that we had, the different capabilities that we had, the different physical capabilities that we had in the first place. So running and lifting things, stuff like that. And I suggest that it works like that for everything, right? Just the way that we are happy when our bodies are like the best expression of our own particular capabilities as a human, and we get there by doing actions that are like what those capabilities were designed to do in the first, or not designed, but developed to do in the first place. I think that to be overall happy, to have a happy life overall, would be to live in the best expression of the way, to live in a way that allows us to use the faculties that we had in a way that they were supposed to be used, or developed to be used. Perhaps, maybe not in exactly the way that we might have used them when they were being developed. That's not really necessary. We don't have to hunt to be healthy. We just have to walk or run. But in some way, and to develop those capacities and to express this whole being health. And the reason I think this constitutes happiness for us is because this is something that necessarily, the reason that we have animals that live and continue to exist is because they seek this expression of their capacities. If they didn't want to, if they didn't find it natural to express their capabilities, then they wouldn't do the things that would help them survive and would die. And this is even true for humans. If the use of our capacities was miserable and we hated it, and the development of capacities made us sadder, we would all quickly die off. But if we evolved to actually enjoy the use of our capacities, then that would make us all the better at surviving, because we would use and develop the things that allowed us to survive better. I mean, think about it this way. Let's break down a biological being for a second. Every organ or limb can be described in terms of the mechanical thing that it does. As in, a heart squeezes, contracts, and expands repeatedly based on an electrical signal that keeps it at a certain rhythm. But any explanation like that is actually incomplete without describing what it actually does to further the whole of everything else that the being does. In this case, the heart actually pumps blood so that the other places can get nutrients and oxygen. And that's actually an important part of the explanation, because the organism actually is developed to do something. Because if it was not developed to do that thing, to survive, keep its genes going, then it wouldn't exist. But interestingly, we don't, even though we are evolved technically to propagate our genes, evolution cannot code for gene propagation directly. It's not that complex. It's not that, it doesn't have a metaphysical connection to the outside world, and it doesn't, it's not that intelligent. It's not that easy to encode something like that. And so instead, the simpler option, which is the option we see it take, is to encode for the use of the capacities that help us survive, and the use of the capacities, of course, that help us reproduce as well. This is why we enjoy sex. And because it codes for proxies. And so it both makes sense that we would have, that a biological organism would have a quote-unquote purpose that it was developed for, because otherwise it wouldn't develop at all. Because although evolution is not directed, it doesn't think of purposes. If something doesn't serve a certain purpose, then it won't lead to that thing continuing. And yet it also makes sense that purpose would not be perfectly encoded as the ultimate end for that would make that thing continue to exist. Instead, it would be encoded for proxies that would help that thing continue to exist in the way that evolution makes things seem purposeful. And so that's why I suggest, and I think it's fairly reasonable, that this thing that is desired for itself, that is the ultimate end that motivates everything else, that overrides everything else, that is an experience that comes before death, is actually the development and fulfillment of our potential capacities and the use of the capacities that we have as humans. And the reason I add that as humans to the end is because every creature does not experience itself as the undifferentiated blob of all the common features it has with other animals. It experiences itself as the creature that it is. So all mammals have common features, but a wolf does not want to live as a rabbit lives. And they don't want to only live in the way to express the capacities that they both share, because those are so few. And imagine you're standing on the top of a pyramid, right? The parts of the pyramid that are closest to you are the parts that point towards you. And just in the same way, the parts that affect you the most about this fulfillment, this happiness, are the parts that are closest to what it actually means to be you. So a self-actualization, an expression of your individual nature, and then an expression of your nature as a human, and then maybe your expression of your nature as an animal if it does not conflict. Now, that was a lot. But I think there might be a few more things that I need to say here. First of all, there is the sort of existentialist objection that, in fact, existence precedes essence, and therefore that man has no nature, that or that we should be very suspicious of any attempt to identify what is the common nature for humans. To that I say, yes, in a sense, essence comes after existence, because existence just simply exists. It doesn't care about us. It's just there. And what we call essence are merely the conceptual abstractions that we take by trying to form useful cross-sections of phenomena that we see in order to handle them more abstractly by taking the details that cross-section have in common and leaving aside the ones that they don't. And so yes, we take an essence, a concept, from the things that exist. And that essence is somewhat arbitrary in the sense that the group of things that we decide to abstract out from is somewhat arbitrary and based on practical necessity. This is why we often see categories that sort of overlap across different dimensions and sometimes refer to a few of the same things but also refer to other things because they're about other things. But on the other hand, if those things were not different, then we would not be able to tell the difference between them. If there was not something that was common to all of the category that we call humans, then we would not be able to tell the difference between a human and a primate or a human and a rock. And if there was not a reason that it made sense to draw this category of humans, because there was some important difference in the way that we had to interact with them, in the way that they interacted with us, and in the way that they presented and affected the world, then we would not have come up with this concept of humans in the first place. And so I think it is acceptable that as long as we draw the lines carefully, as long as we do not become overly attached to the specific way our cultures are, as long as we don't think that the way we live is the only way that humans should live, and that as long as we're careful, I think it is valid to try to find a nature, a common features to this conceptual abstraction of practical necessity that we call human. So I think it's a good time to end this lecture. Catch you guys in the next one.